Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I have been given this task of identifying and analyzing domestic drivers of India's neighbourhood policy. I would begin by saying that India's neighbourhood policy is more than a mere subset of India's foreign policy. Neighbourhood has always received disproportionate attention in India's diplomatic priorities. The current government's neighbourhood first policy is a natural outgrowth of the policy advocated by previous governments towards India's neighbours. Before I come to the domestic drivers, let me first walk you through India's foreign policy outlook, and then I will come to the neighbourhood policy, and subsequently I will go on to domestic drivers. I must first identify with the way India talks about the world, the way India defines its foreign policy. Indian Foreign Office, if we go through its literature, Indian Foreign Office has outlined the fundamental principles of India's foreign policy as respect for state sovereignty, peaceful settlement of disputes, the use of force as a last resort, and opposition to all attempts to reorder societies from outside with military force. India's foreign policy, the literature says, is rooted in the national ethos, supports the processes of national development and transformation through the furtherance of the country's national interest. It seeks to ensure India's security, promote its socio-economic development, maintain strategic autonomy, which comes again and again in the foreign policy literature, and work towards a more just global order. It also says that India aspires for a peaceful and secure periphery. Neighbourhood is important here. It aspires for a peaceful and secure periphery, expand its ties with extended neighbourhood, its concentric circles, first neighbourhood, then the extended neighbourhood, cordial and balanced relations with major powers, and mutually beneficial partnerships with developing countries. In recent years, especially after the current government assumed office, I saw that there is no effort to go beyond the official reiteration of this policy, and there is basically a departure in the sense that there is a willingness to participate in global affairs. So officially it has been stated, just give me a moment. Is interfering. Now officially it is being acknowledged and claimed that India is trying increasingly to occupy a new role in the world as a confident and articulate rising power, willing to claim its place on the global high table and able to discharge its responsibilities. No longer content to merely react to international developments, India has frequently acted to shape and even initiate these developments on issues ranging from global governance, global institutional reforms, to climate change, multilateral trade negotiations, internet governance and cyber security, and transnational terrorism. So there is a willingness to participate in global in the global arena, and the years of reluctance are over. So this is what the new government would try to tell you. But at the same time, the new government would tell you that immediate neighborhood continues to remain an area of the greatest attention and emphasis. We at IDSA, this is what the foreign policy outlook of India is. We at IDSA in 2011-12 decided to undertake a research project on India's neighborhood policy. Me, my colleague Smriti Patnaik and Dr. Arvind Gupta, who later on became Deputy National Security Advisor, three of us were working on that project, and the project was on neighborhood policy. When we started the project, we started asking ourselves, does India have a neighborhood policy? I remember having met a senior retired foreign service official, and when I asked him, does India have a neighborhood policy? He said, why are you trying to define neighborhood policy? Not having a policy is also a policy. So what we found, that this policy articulation remained very fuzzy and relatively under-articulated. But we tried to isolate some of the elements of this unarticulated policy. And we concluded by saying that India must try to communicate its vision of regional integration to its neighbors and enable them to participate profitably in its growing economy, spell out its non-negotiables in matters concerning security and national interest, maintain linkages at the highest political level, open multiple tracks of communication, and take a leadership position in multilateral forums like SAARC and BIMSTEC to bring peace and prosperity to the region. When we tried to identify the main elements of India's approach to neighborhood, we found there were 5 distinct elements. They were interrelated. First was concern for security takes precedence over economic interest in India's neighborhood policy. Second, India has not attempted to impose any political ideology on any of its neighbors. It has stolidly avoided any attempt to transport its version of secularism or democracy to these countries. Third, there is an open denial of Indian intent to have a sphere of influence. Officially, we have never stated this. But India has reflexively shown its anxiety and concerns about extra-regional powers seeking to increase their strategic footprints in the region. This was true of the Cold War. This is true of the post-Cold War. In the Cold War years, it was United States and the West. In the post-Cold War theater, it is China. India has, over the years, and especially since the 1990s, provided non-reciprocal and unilateral concessions to its neighbors. But there is an exception. The exception is Pakistan. And this became the core of Gujarat Doctrine in the mid-1990s. India has invited all its neighbors to participate in its economy and reap the benefits of it. Fifth, Pakistan has remained a major foreign policy challenge. India has been particularly concerned about Sino-Pakistan strategic linkages as well as growing Chinese influence in the neighborhood in recent years. So our search for this domestic driver should be undertaken in this context. I must tell you that during my PhD days, I had borrowed linkage theory framework from James Rogenew to analyze India-Pakistan relations during 1980s. James Rogenew, this theory came up in 1960s, as you know. By late 1970s, James Rogenew had looked the other way. But I continue to see many scholars in many parts of the world borrowing heavily on him. But I will not borrow from James Rogenew here. I know his essential principle that politics anywhere is connected with politics everywhere, and the domestic international linkages are explained by this essential principle. Let us now shift our attention to the drivers of domestic politics. When I looked back for the literature on the subject, I found out that in 1981, the first book on domestic roots of India's foreign policy came up. It was written by an eminent political scientist, A. Appadurai, and it dealt with domestic roots of India's domestic policy, foreign policy between 1947 and 1972. He isolated 5 elements, 5 domestic roots. They were tradition and history, the legacy issues, democracy, demand for economic development, pluralistic nature of the society, and leadership. And especially harped on the charismatic personality and leadership of Nehru at that point of time. He concluded that the way politics moved during this period and the way the neighborhood policy was framed, the parliament had absolutely no role to play in this. So the leadership, the cabinet taking the decision on these issues, it largely ignored the parliament. There were only 5 occasions when some issues were taken up, and in 3 of them the parliament was completely neglected, and on 2 issues there were some concerns taken into account by the cabinet. From there, let us now jump to the present scenario, how things are panning out. We all know, and it is a truism, that India is a plural country, it is fragmented, so many cleavages. It is a state nation comprising of many nations, cultures, communities, religious and interest groups. It is still a state nation in the making. It is a country of continental proportions. It has a bit of all its neighboring states within itself, as much as neighboring states also have bits of India in themselves. If one were to look at the overlapping ethnicities and linguistic communities that inhabit the region, we see that leaving out only 4 states of India, all other states have either territorial or maritime frontiers, maritime boundaries with other states in the neighborhood. There are historical, cultural, and geographical contiguities which continue to bring the people together and the politics across the borders together as well. Foreign policy makers in India have found it difficult to negotiate with this reality. Let me now come to the drivers that I have identified. First of all, it is the ethno-linguistic contiguity. It's an important driver. The cases in point here are the Tamils of Tamil Nadu having ethnic linkages with the Tamils of Sri Lanka, the linguistic affinity between the people of Paschima Banga and Bangladesh, the linguistic affinities between the 2 Punjabs in India and Pakistan, the linkages between northern states and the people of Nepal, especially the Tarai region where the Madhesis stay, and the linkages between communities in northeastern states and their ethnic cousins across the border in Myanmar. And last but not the least, one must not forget the large Muslim population in India and their co-religionists in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Because of these linkages, India has been drawn into internal political matrices in the neighborhood against its wishes. The cases in point here are Indian intervention in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Interestingly, in some cases, like in the cases of Nepal and Sri Lanka, the neighboring states have felt deeply insecure about these linkages and resorted to policies that have forced certain policy pronouncements by India. The case of Tamil ethnic problem in Sri Lanka continuing to influence India-Sri Lanka relations in spite of the elimination of LTT proves this point. The next is center-state relations, what is known as federal relations. In the backdrop of the recent effort by Indian government to settle the land boundary dispute with Bangladesh, it's very interesting to see that even if this issue was resolved, there were other issues which could not be resolved. The inability of NDA, this government, to resolve the Tista river sharing issue with Bangladesh because of resistance from the government in Paschim Banga, which was earlier West Bengal, is a case in point. Similarly, as regards the fishermen issue, India has found, the central government has found it very difficult to negotiate with the Tamil Nadu government on the issue of fishermen over the years. This is not to say, not to deny that there were instances in the past where the central government had completely ignored these local sympathies and local concerns. One such case was in the 1970s about the Kachatibu island being given away to Sri Lanka. Third is the religious communal divides. There are, in many cases, there are this religious and communal factors also influencing India's approach to the neighborhood. Pakistan's effort to project itself as the guardian of the Indian Muslims has not gelled well with the Muslim people of India, and has also indirectly created antipathy towards Pakistan in the Indian official establishment. Similarly, despite the presence of a vocal constituency within the ruling establishment today to send military contingents to Afghanistan, the Indian government has avoided taking such risks out of concerns about possible negative reaction from the large Muslim population. And this is something which attests to the fact that the domestic constituency does influence certain foreign policies. Even if this government is regarded as very, very forceful in its approach, even they have not managed to stay uninfluenced by all this. Last but not the least,
3 minutes.
Last but not the least, domestic consensus over how to deal with China and Pakistan has also remained a major roadblock. Even if the government of the day wants to find a via media with China and Pakistan, it has been really difficult on the part of the government to do that because of hypersensitivity in the public opinion about these two countries. One doesn't know because there is a feeling that this is being whipped up by the government or the ruling dispensation of the day, but I would say that this is not entirely correct. The antipathy and the negative connotations about negative perception of these two countries continue to inhibit the government's approach to all this. There are three other elements that I wanted to focus on. Maybe we'll take it up in the during the Q&A. One is the anti-hegemonic responses when one political party tries to dominate the political scene in the government. The political consensus that was there in the domestic sphere tends to break down. This is what is happening also in some cases. Like the opposition political parties are not trying to support Indian government's neighborhood policy to a certain extent. Then there are other issues like corruption, malgovernance, and type of government also. So I will talk about it if I am permitted during the question and answer session. Thank you.